Hey guys, Brian Todd of Camille Woodworking here, and here's the conclusion of the mid-century Hutch build. Enjoy it!
After I got the Hutch out of the clamps, I went to my Rotex, put on 80 grit, and I flattened all the edges and the corners. Then I used a number 4 block plane to flatten any areas that had been rounded, and clamping the whole thing to the table really helped to keep it from moving. I then needed to trim up the back panel. I already had one edge perfectly square, so I simply ran it through the saw stop to get it to the desired size. I then ran the panel through the Supermax drum sander at 80 grit to get to its final 5/8 thickness. I then sanded the inside and outside of the panel with 120 grit. I would finish sand at 220 later on. Attaching the back panel was simple. I simply drilled a pilot hole so that the panel wouldn't split, countersank the hole, and then used some number 8 1.5 inch screws. I then trim routed the whole thing with a 1 inch flush trim bit. Then it was on to doors. I ran the doors through the drum sander at 80 grit until I got them to the desired 3/4 inch thickness. Using my Festool TS75 track saw, I squared each door. The hutch wasn't perfectly square, so many of the sides weren't perfect. So it took a lot of measuring and fitting until I was happy with the way it looked. Then it was time to attach the door hardware. I found these solid brass door poles at the supply house, and after finding the center on the door and drilling the holes, they were a perfect fit. After that, I headed over to the drill press. Since I used European-style hinges, I had to use a 35mm Forstner bit, but I could have also used a 1 3/8 Forstner bit. Also, don't drill through the front of your doors. I may or may not have made that mistake. I then final sanded the doors with the Rotex. I hit it with 180 grit and finished at 220. You can also see that I added an 1/8 inch metal cleat to keep the door flat. I set my taper jig to 10 degrees and then I ripped a 10-inch board in half, thus giving me 2 legs. I then trimmed all the legs to the same length and cut the top and bottom miters. I set the miter saw to 20 degrees as I wanted a pretty aggressive angle for the legs. After I cut the skirts, I sanded every piece to 80 grit and then began to lay out the pieces. After that, I marked where I wanted the dominoes to go. I then began the really tricky process of dominoing the base together. There was a lot of trial and error needed, so I used a scrap piece, but that didn't necessarily mean that it went together as planned. Then came the tricky process of clamping, so I basically clamped the skirts to the table and then added shims to the sides to keep the clamps from moving. After a night in the clamps, I sanded the whole thing to 120 grit and smoothed out any raised edges. After that, I used a 3/8 roundover bit and my rigid trim router to give the base a little bit of shape. I then used my Craig jig to attach the base. Notice that I only drilled the holes on the skirts that are going vertically with the grain, not horizontally. If screwed in across the grain, it would not allow the wood to move and would split the whole thing. I then squared the whole base to the bottom and drove the screws in. Since I had drilled the holes for the hinges 2 inches down, I just had to mark 2 inches from the top and bottom of each side and then attach the hinge bracket, and then checking with my combination square to ensure that it was 90 degrees from the edge. I did the exact same thing for the hinges and the doors and made sure I checked it with the square. I then attached the right speaker door, and a lot of tinkering was needed to ensure that it was a good fit. I then attached the left door and it was the same story there. A lot of tinkering and sanding down the edges to ensure it was a good fit. After that, I attached the door stops so that the doors would sit flush. When the doors were fitted and I was happy with them, I needed to sand the whole thing to 220 grit. It was back to the trusty Rotex for that job. I drilled a 3/4 inch hole with a Forstner bit for the top and a 1 3/8 hole for the bottom. I knew the bottom needed to be bigger because that's where my plug for my sound system would come out. After that, I heated up my brand and branded the back of the panel. I then hit the back and the insides with the Rotex and 220 grit. I then lifted the hutch off the table and sanded the top to 220. Then it was on to finishing. I used General Finishes Armor Seal in satin and applied the first coat with a foam brush. And here are the spoils of your hard work, when you see that color of the grain pop out at you. I then sprayed the first coat on the rest. I knew it would be a way faster way to get the first coat on, and then I would sand a 400 grit and apply a second and third coat with a foam brush. After it was dry, it was time to reattach all the hardware. I labeled where everything went and kept track of all my screws. The left door went on with no problem. I needed to attach the speaker grill, and this was the trickiest part of the whole build. I ripped down some walnut to 1x1 and screwed it to the inside to hold the grill down. I did my best to keep it taut and straight. This took a lot of attaching and reattaching until I got it right. After trimming the excess off the grill, I attached it to the hutch. The door had expanded during finishing and thus made the door too tight, so I had to sand the top and refinish it.